The story of bowling in America is a bit complicated. People think of it as a fun, family-friendly game today. But for a long time, it was looked at with suspicion. It even faced outright bans or very tough rules in many US states. These weren't always total bans on the game itself, but they were often severe restrictions on when and how it could be played. These rules made it very hard, sometimes impossible, for bowling alleys to operate. This wasn't about the game itself being bad, it was about what bowling was connected to. It was about how society saw leisure. It was about moral ideas of the time, and it was about specific laws that tried to control public life. Bowling is an old game. People have been rolling balls at pins for thousands of years. The version we know, with pins arranged in a triangle, came from Germany. It arrived in America with immigrants. They brought their traditions and their love for the game. By the early 1800s, bowling was popping up in growing American cities. Because it was a social activity, men would gather after a long day of work, they would play a few frames, they would often have a drink or two. This casual, often rowdy atmosphere is where some of the problems started. It set a public image for bowling that was hard to shake. Early bowling alleys were not like the bright, modern centers we see now. They were usually in the back rooms of taverns, or they were in basements of buildings. They were often dark places, they were smoky from cigars and pipes, they were noisy with the sound of crashing pins and laughter. These were seen as places for working men. This was a time when American cities were expanding rapidly. Many people were new to America. They worked hard, often physically demanding, jobs in factories or on the docks. They lived in crowded neighborhoods. Bowling was a simple, affordable way to relax. It was a welcome break from the grind of tough factory work. It was a place to be with friends. It was a community hub for some groups. This provided a sense of belonging for people far from their homelands. They could speak their native tongues, they could share stories, and they could enjoy a familiar pastime. But this image wasn't always positive in the eyes of everyone. Some people, especially those from the emerging middle and upper classes, saw these places as dens of iniquity. That's an old way of saying places where bad things happen. They worried a lot about gambling. They worried about too much drinking, they worried about men spending their hard-earned money and precious time there. These concerns were deeply rooted in the moral standards of the day. There was a strong belief in hard work. There was a strong belief in saving money. There was a strong belief in sober living. Anything that seemed to threaten these values was viewed with deep suspicion. People believed that wasting money or time on frivolous activities could lead to poverty and a breakdown of social order. This was especially true for the working class, who were often perceived as needing more moral guidance. In the mid-1800s, some states even tried to ban specific types of bowling. New York tried to ban 9 pins in 1841. This was directly because of gambling concerns. People were betting on games, they were losing money. The state government saw this as a serious problem. They didn't want people wasting their wages on games of chance. They didn't want to see the poor getting poorer because of gambling debts. They feared a spiral into destitution and crime. So they simply banned the game of 9 pins outright. This ban, like many others, wasn't perfectly effective. People found ways around it. A common workaround was to add a 10th pin. This created 10-pin bowling, the version most popular today. It was a clever way to legally distinguish the game from the banned 9 pins, but it clearly showed that authorities were already watching these activities very closely. They were ready to step in with laws to control them if they felt public morality was at risk. The very act of adding a pin to bypass a law highlights how serious the legislative pushback against gambling was. The idea of productive time was very important back then. People believed in hard work above almost everything else. They believed in saving money for the future. They believed in building a good life through diligent effort and self-control. Leisure time was fine, but only in moderation, and it had to be wholesome leisure, something that either refreshed the body for more work or uplifted the spirit. If leisure seemed to lead to bad habits, or if it took people away from their duties to family or work, it was quickly seen as a significant problem. Bowling, with its tavern connections and persistent gambling rumors, often fell into this problematic category for many influential people. It wasn't seen as healthy exercise, like a brisk walk or field work. It wasn't seen as building character, like reading or attending lectures or community meetings. It was just seen as a distraction. It was a potential drain on a man's resources and moral fiber, threatening the stability of his family and the community. Imagine the common fear of a concerned citizen of that era. A man works hard all week. He gets his weekly pay. Then he goes straight to the bowling alley, he drinks several beers. He places small bets on his games. He spends hours there, laughing and shouting while his responsibilities go unmet. Meanwhile, his family is at home, they might be waiting for him, they might desperately need that money for food or rent or coal for heating. This was a very common fear, fueled by sermons and social campaigns. It led to a lot of judgment from moral reformers and community leaders who viewed such behavior as a direct assault on the family unit and societal order. It created a negative shadow over the entire activity of bowling. This shadow would follow bowling for many decades to come. It would be a significant reason for future legal troubles and widespread bans. The perception of bowling as a potentially harmful pastime linked to vice and idleness took deep root in the public consciousness. This deep-seated suspicion was the first major hurdle for the sport in America, establishing a precedent for intervention by the state. One of the biggest and longest-lasting reasons bowling faced bans and severe restrictions was something called blue laws. These laws were very common in America for hundreds of years. Their purpose was simple. They were designed to keep Sunday as a special day. A day dedicated to rest. A day for religious worship. A day for quiet family time. These laws had their roots in the strong religious beliefs of many early American settlers. They firmly believed that Sunday should be different from all other days of the week. It was a day of sacred observance, a day to honor God and refrain from worldly pursuits. So, blue laws restricted all kinds of activities on Sundays. You couldn't buy certain goods. Many stores, from small shops to larger markets, had to be closed completely. You couldn't perform many types of work, especially public or commercial labor. And, very importantly for bowling, you couldn't engage in many forms of entertainment or public amusement. This prohibition often included operating theaters or music halls. It included holding large sporting events like horse races or baseball games. And it very specifically included opening and running bowling alleys. For many years, it was simply illegal to open a bowling alley on a Sunday in countless states. This prohibition extended to specific cities and even smaller counties, reflecting local moral consensus. This wasn't always a total ban on bowling as a game itself, but it was a ban on when you could do it. For any business, being forced to shut down one full day a week, especially a day with high leisure demand, is a massive problem. Sundays were often the busiest days for leisure activities, as people were off work and looking for ways to spend their free time. Not being able to operate on Sunday cut deep into profits, sometimes making up a third or more of a week's potential income. It made running a bowling alley much, much harder. In some places, these mandatory Sunday closures made it impossible for a bowling alley business to survive. The financial hit was simply too great to sustain operations through the rest of the week. The push for strict blue laws came from many powerful groups. Religious organizations, particularly Protestant churches, were very strong advocates. They genuinely believed it was their moral duty to protect the sanctity of Sunday. They saw public entertainment and commercial activities on Sunday as a direct distraction from spiritual duties. They saw it as leading people away from church and contemplation. They viewed it as breaking a divine commandment, such as the biblical injunction to keep the Sabbath holy. These groups often held significant political and social power in local governments and state legislatures. They successfully pushed for the passage and strict enforcement of these laws, making their influence widespread and deeply ingrained in public policy. The police would actively raid bowling alleys found operating on Sundays. They would arrest the owners or managers, who faced fines or even jail time. They would fine the players or even the spectators found inside. They would forcibly shut down the operations for the day, often locking the doors or posting notices. This wasn't a rare or isolated occurrence. It happened regularly in many communities across America for decades, from small towns to major cities. People who simply wanted to bowl were caught up in these larger moral and religious battles. They faced legal consequences for what we now see as harmless recreation, demonstrating the severe impact of these laws on daily life. And it wasn't just bowling that suffered under blue laws. Other popular sports and entertainment venues faced similar issues. And Major League Baseball games were often banned on Sundays in many cities, forcing teams to play doubleheaders on Saturdays or travel to less restrictive areas. Movie theaters couldn't open their doors until later in the evening, or sometimes not at all. Even simple things like buying groceries, doing laundry, or purchasing a newspaper could be illegal in some towns, restricting everyday activities for everyone. But bowling alleys, with their existing reputation from Chapter 1, their association with taverns and potential gambling, often received extra scrutiny. They were already seen as somewhat questionable places. This made them easy targets for moral crusaders looking to enforce Sunday observance, as they fit the profile of unwholesome leisure. The arguments against Sunday bowling went beyond just religious doctrine. Some social reformers argued that it promoted idleness and laziness among the working class. They said it took men away from their homes and families on the day they should be with them, nurturing domestic bonds. They claimed it broke up the traditional family unit by providing an alternative to church and home life. These were social arguments, but they were often cloaked in religious language and moral outrage. The prevailing belief was that a structured, quiet Sunday was good for society as a whole, fostering social cohesion and moral uprightness. They saw active, noisy, and commercial entertainment as disruptive to this desired social order, leading to moral decay and social fragmentation. Over time, these rigid laws did begin to loosen, but it was a very slow, gradual process, often taking generations. As America became more diverse in its religious makeup, with a growing number of Catholic, Jewish, and non-Christian citizens, not everyone shared the same strict views on Sunday observance. More and more people, especially in urban areas, wanted to have freedom in how they spent their weekends, embracing a more modern view of leisure. There was a growing public demand for a wider range of entertainment options. Bowling alley owners and their supporters fought back against these laws, often through legal challenges and lobbying efforts. They argued for the right to operate a legitimate business. They argued that bowling was a harmless and healthy form of fun. They saw these laws as unfair, outdated, and economically damaging. But in many parts of the country, blue laws stayed on the books for a very long time. Some weren't formally repealed until the very late 20th century, decades after they had become largely unenforced. Even if they weren't strictly enforced everywhere all the time, the threat of enforcement was always there, hanging over businesses. For decades, these laws severely limited where and when bowling could exist. They effectively banned bowling for a full day of the week, which was often its most profitable day. This made it a constant struggle for the sport to gain widespread acceptance as a mainstream, fully legitimate activity. It kept it operating in a legal gray area for many, many years. The shadow of the blue laws was a long one. It deeply impacted the growth, profitability, and public perception of bowling, forcing many alleys to operate under constant threat of closure or hefty fines, severely hindering their development. Bowling's biggest problem in many states and cities was its very close link to what people in those times called vice. This wasn't just a casual association, it was a deep-seated connection with things like gambling and excessive drinking. From its earliest days in America, bowling alleys were often the scene of these activities. This made them an easy target for bans and very tight regulations. The perception was that these places were inherently problematic, attracting undesirable elements and promoting harmful behaviors. Think about how bowling became popular in America. It often flourished in taverns, saloons, and various drinking establishments. These were places where men went to drink alcohol, socialize, and escape the pressures of daily life. And where there's drinking, especially among groups of men, there's often betting. It was just a common social practice of the era to add a little extra excitement to games. People would bet on who could get the highest score in a frame or a game. They'd bet small amounts of money, sometimes a quarter or a dollar. Or they'd bet rounds of drinks for the group, making the stakes even higher in a social sense. While this was often seen as harmless fun by the players themselves, a way to spice up the game, for the authorities and moral reformers, it looked exactly like gambling. And gambling was frequently illegal across states. It was seen as morally wrong. It was often viewed as a path to financial ruin and social decay for many people, particularly the working poor who could ill afford to lose their wages. The fear was very real that these bowling alleys were becoming mini casinos, places where people could easily lose their entire weekly wages, leaving their families destitute. Places where they could quickly fall into debt, leading to crime or bankruptcy. This was a serious concern for a society that deeply valued hard work, personal responsibility, and financial prudence. The lawmakers genuinely saw it as their duty to protect citizens from these perceived vices, viewing them as threats to individual and communal well-being. They felt a strong need to step in and regulate, so they often passed specific laws directly against gambling in these types of establishments, making any form of wagering illegal. This created a very risky environment for bowling alley owners. If even small, friendly bets were happening on their premises, they could face raids, arrests, fines, and outright closure. The consequences were severe and could end a business overnight. And then there was the alcohol itself. As bowling alleys and bars went hand in hand for a very long time, people played and they drank. Sometimes a lot, especially after a hard day's work. This connection often led to other problems in the eyes of the public and authorities. Drunkenness could escalate, leading to boisterous behavior. Noise levels could become excessive and disruptive to nearby residents, especially late at night. Potential fights and disorderly conduct were real possibilities when alcohol flowed freely. These places could easily be seen as rowdy, unrefined, and not at all respectable, contrasting sharply with the quiet, orderly vision many had for public spaces. His neighbors and other community members often complained loudly about the noise emanating from these establishments late into the night. They also complained about intoxicated people spilling out onto the streets, causing disturbances or public nuisances. This negative perception led to many local and state governments trying to control bowling alleys through their liquor licenses. They would put very strict limits on how alcohol could be sold. They might even refuse to grant a liquor license to an establishment that also featured bowling, forcing it to choose one or the other. Or they might impose very early closing times, cutting into prime evening business hours when people were most likely to bowl and drink. In some extreme cases, they banned alcohol altogether from places that had bowling lanes, a devastating blow to the business. This was a huge financial blow to the business model of most bowling alleys. For many, selling drinks was a significant, if not primary, part of their income. Taking that away could make it entirely impossible for the business to stay open and profitable, effectively forcing them to close. These concerns weren't entirely fictional or exaggerated. Some bowling alleys probably were loud. Some probably did have problems with drunkenness and minor altercations, just like some taverns did. But the bigger problem was that this bad image stuck to all bowling alleys, even the ones that tried very hard to be respectable and well run, maintaining a quiet atmosphere. They all got painted with the same negative brush. They were all seen as places that encouraged bad behavior, or at least provided an environment where it could easily happen. This collective guilt made it difficult for any bowling establishment to escape scrutiny and prejudiced views, regardless of their actual conduct. The powerful temperance movements of the time also played a significant role in this. These groups, which ultimately led to the National Prohibition era, wanted to ban alcohol entirely. They saw bowling alleys as a key part of the problem, a node in the network of establishments that promoted drinking. They directly linked bowling to the evils of drink, portraying it as a gateway activity. They argued passionately that these places broke up families by luring men away from home and encouraging wasteful spending. They argued that they corrupted young men by exposing them to vice and low moral standards. The influence of these temperance groups was very strong in many parts of America, giving them significant sway with lawmakers and the public, leading to widespread support for strict regulation. So, when a state or city decided to crack down on gambling or alcohol, bowling alleys were often among the first types of businesses targeted. The specific laws might not explicitly say no bowling. Instead, they would say things like no gambling allowed in any public place of amusement, or no alcohol sold after a certain time at establishments providing entertainment. These laws, while not directly naming bowling, had the practical effect of making it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for many bowling alleys to operate legally and profitably. For many, it was effectively a ban. They simply couldn't survive under such tight restrictions, especially those that cut off their main sources of income and reduced their customer base. The connection to vice was a heavy burden that bowling carried for a very long time, defining its public perception for generations. Another major reason bowling faced bans and strict rules was deeply linked to growing concerns about young people. Specifically, it had a lot to do with the job of pin setter. For a very long time, before machines took over the job, bowling pins were set by hand. Young boys, often called pin boys or pin setters, did this work, and society, particularly reformers and child welfare advocates, had increasingly strong negative feelings about children working in places like bowling alleys. This concern became a powerful force for social change and regulation. Being a pin setter was a tough and often dangerous job. The boys had to quickly run out onto the lane, gather the fallen pins, and reset them in the correct formation after each ball was thrown. They worked in a pit at the end of the lane, constantly exposed to flying pins and the potential impact of heavy bowling balls. Pins could fly unpredictably. Heavy bowling balls could sometimes hit them if a bowler was careless or if the boy was too slow to react. The work environment itself was also a significant concern. These alleys were often dark, poorly lit, noisy from the crashing pins, and smoky from tobacco, making it an unhealthy environment for anyone, let alone a child. Boys worked long hours, frequently late into the night, especially on weekends and holidays when bowling was most popular. They were paid very little for their demanding labor, often earning just a few cents per game or per hour. This was all happening at a time in American history when child labor laws were becoming a big national issue. Public sentiment was shifting dramatically, with a growing consensus that children shouldn't be working in dangerous, unhealthy conditions. They shouldn't be missing out on school and a proper education. So, for many social reformers and advocates for child welfare, bowling alleys became powerful symbols of child exploitation. They saw these young boys being exposed to deeply problematic influences. They were often around drinking adults, some of whom might be intoxicated or gambling. They were around men who might use rough language, tell inappropriate jokes, or exhibit other behaviors considered morally corrupting. This environment was seen as very bad for their moral development, a place where innocence could be lost. It was viewed as leading them down a path of delinquency and moral corruption rather than healthy growth and preparation for responsible adulthood. The sight of small boys toiling in such conditions stirred public outrage. Groups advocating for children's rights and well-being pushed hard for new laws and rules. They wanted to protect children from such harmful work environments and ensure they had the chance to attend school. This often meant trying to shut down places that employed pinsetters, or, at the very least, they pushed for very strict restrictions on their working hours, age, and conditions, such as requiring breaks or banning night work. They argued forcefully that bowling alleys were simply not suitable places for minors to work, given the physical dangers and moral exposures. They believed these places posed significant risks to the physical and moral health of young boys, potentially stunting their growth and twisting their character. Laws started to appear across various states and cities that strictly limited when children could work. They also limited where children could work, banning them from certain dangerous or morally dubious occupations. These new child labor laws often directly impacted bowling alleys more severely than many other businesses. If a bowling alley couldn't legally hire boys to set pins, it faced a massive operational challenge. Automatic pin setting machines didn't widely exist yet, or were very primitive, unreliable, and prohibitively expensive for most small alley owners. So, it was either hand set pins by human labor, which was now illegal for minors, or no bowling could happen at all. This situation effectively banned bowling in many places where such child labor was prohibited or heavily restricted because the fundamental operation of the game became impossible. Beyond the specific issue of working conditions for pin boys, there were also broader moral concerns about any youth simply being present in bowling alleys. Even if teenagers weren't working, they might hang out there for recreation, especially after school or on weekends. This was seen as a potential problem by many parents and community leaders. Parents worried deeply that their kids would get into trouble falling in with the wrong crowd. They worried about their kids being exposed to the vice we discussed earlier, the gambling, the drinking, the rough language, the potential for unsavory characters. The bowling alley was often lumped in with other places like pool halls, dime museums, and dance halls as places where good kids shouldn't be, as they were believed to lead to moral decline. This widespread anxiety led to the implementation of rules about age limits for who could even enter a bowling alley. Some towns or states mandated that no minors were allowed at all without adult supervision, effectively banning unaccompanied youth. Or they might only be allowed at certain times of the day before the rower crowd or late-night patrons arrived. This again made it harder for bowling alleys to attract a wider customer base beyond their traditional male, working-class demographic. It limited their appeal, especially if they wanted to shed their working-class image and become more mainstream or family-friendly. It added another layer of legal and public scrutiny. They weren't just places for adults to play anymore. They were places that affected the moral development of the youth, and that made them a bigger target for moral crusaders and stricter legal controls, intensifying the pressure on the industry. The idea of juvenile delinquency was also a growing and serious concern in the early 20th century. People worried intensely about young people straying from good behavior and getting involved in crime or petty mischief. They feared a breakdown of traditional values among the younger generation. Places like bowling alleys, along with pool halls and arcades, were often blamed as breeding grounds for such problems. They were seen as places where kids could easily get into mischief, form bad habits, skip school, or worse, get involved with gangs or petty crime, moving from harmless fun to serious wrongdoing. This perception, whether entirely fair or not, was incredibly powerful in shaping public opinion and legislative action. It gave lawmakers yet another strong reason to impose stringent controls on bowling establishments, viewing them as potential threats to social order and youth welfare. So, the cause of protecting the youth became a powerful rallying cry. It was a very strong argument used to justify regulating or even banning bowling in certain contexts. It played on people's deepest fears and anxieties about the future generation and the moral fabric of society. This made it very difficult for bowling to be seen as a clean, wholesome, family-friendly sport for many years. The lingering image of the young, exploited pinsetter or the idle teenager hanging around a smoky, questionable alley cast a long shadow. It was a major hurdle for bowling to overcome in its quest for mainstream acceptance. It meant that for decades, bowling often operated under a cloud of suspicion, and it faced constant pressure to change its ways or risk being shut down completely by law, losing its right to exist in many communities. Bowling didn't just disappear because of these bans and strict restrictions, far from it. The sport fought back with remarkable resilience. It adapted to changing times. It worked very hard to change its negative public image from a questionable pastime to a respected sport. And slowly, over many decades, it earned its rightful place as a popular, respected, and mainstream sport in America. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a long, determined struggle by countless individuals and organizations who believed in the game and its potential. One of the biggest and most crucial steps in this fight for legitimacy was the creation of governing bodies for the sport. The American Bowling Congress ABC was formed in 1895. This was a pivotal moment. It brought much needed order and structure to what had often been a disorganized and fragmented pastime. The ABC standardized rules across different regions, ensuring that a 300 game in New York meant the same thing as in California. It helped establish common playing conditions and equipment specifications. It created a framework for organized competition, fostering leagues and tournaments with recognized results. This move was essential for forging a more professional, serious image for bowling. Before the ABC, bowling often felt like a casual, somewhat chaotic game, played more for local bragging rights than for national prestige. The ABC helped make it a serious, legitimate sport, demanding skill, discipline, and fair play. This formalization was very important for gaining respectability in the eyes of the public and lawmakers. They pushed for ethical conduct among players and proprietors, actively trying to distance the game from its seedier past. Another truly massive change was technological innovation. The invention and widespread adoption of the automatic pin setter was a game changer of immense proportions for the bowling industry. These complex machines started to appear in the 1930s, but they really became widespread and affordable after World War II, revolutionizing operations. They completely replaced the human pin setters. This solved a major, long-standing problem for the sport. There were no more child labor concerns, as the machines took over the dangerous late-night work. No more worries about young boys working in dark, smoky, potentially dangerous alleys. This single invention removed one of the most significant reasons for moral objections and legal restrictions against bowling, effectively neutralizing a powerful argument used by reformers. It made bowling operations much more efficient, allowing for faster play and higher volume. And it also made them safer for everyone involved, removing human risk from the lanes. And in the long run, it made running a bowling alley cheaper and more standardized, as labor costs decreased and reliability increased. Bowling alleys themselves also began to change their physical design and atmosphere. Owners consciously worked to shed the old, negative image of the dark, smoky tavern or the seedy basement establishment. They wanted to attract a broader, more desirable customer base beyond their traditional male, working-class demographic. This meant making alleys brighter, cleaner, and more welcoming. They invested in modern lighting, better ventilation systems to clear smoke, and more comfortable seating areas. They aimed to attract families, women, and middle-class patrons, actively marketing to these new groups. This transformation meant investing significant capital in creating better, more appealing facilities. And it meant offering a wider range of food and drinks, often moving away from just alcohol to include soft drinks, hot dogs, and family-friendly meal options. It meant actively cultivating a wholesome, fun, and respectable atmosphere, explicitly contrasting with the previous unsavory reputation. Many alleys became part of larger entertainment complexes, further diversifying their offerings. The long fight against the restrictive blue laws was also a critical part of bowling's journey to legitimacy. As American society continued to evolve and become more diverse and secular, many people began to push back strongly against these old, religiously inspired restrictions. Bowling alley owners, often in alliance with other entertainment businesses like movie theaters and sports venues, actively lobbied local and state governments. They argued passionately that these laws were outdated and no longer reflected modern societal values. They claimed the laws were unfair, economically harmful to businesses, and limited people's fundamental freedom to choose how they spent their leisure time. They emphasized the economic benefits of Sunday operations, including job creation and tax revenue. Slowly but surely, many of these archaic blue laws were either formally repealed or simply stopped being strictly enforced by authorities, falling into disuse. This gradual loosening of restrictions allowed bowling alleys to open their doors on Sundays, which, as we discussed, was a huge boost to their business and profitability. It helped them become fully integrated into mainstream American leisure culture, aligning with public demand for weekend entertainment. World War II also played a surprisingly significant role in bowling's rehabilitation and popularization. Bowling became an incredibly popular recreation for American soldiers both at home and abroad. It was a simple, accessible way for servicemen to relax, relieve stress, and build camaraderie with their fellow troops, fostering unit cohesion. Many military bases had bowling lanes, and the game was encouraged as a healthy diversion. After the war, millions of returning veterans brought their newfound love for the game home with them. They sought out places to bowl in their communities, often introducing their families to the sport. This widespread post-war popularity helped normalize the sport even further. It made bowling seem more patriotic, more wholesome, and more ingrained in the fabric of American life. It cemented its image as a healthy American pastime that could be enjoyed by everyone, including families. The rise of mass media, particularly television, further propelled bowling into the mainstream in the mid-20th century. As bowling became a televised sport, with popular programs like the Pro Bowlers Tour attracting a national audience. People could watch skilled professional bowlers compete for high stakes from the comfort of their homes. This televised exposure gave the sport immense legitimacy and prestige. It showcased bowling as a game of precision, strategy, and athletic skill rather than just a casual tavern diversion. It made heroes out of top bowlers, turning them into household names. It helped raise its profile and acceptance across the entire country, reaching millions of homes that might never have visited an alley, demystifying the activity and making it appear respectable. This helped erase lingering negative stereotypes, so by the latter half of the 20th century, bowling had largely and successfully overcome its long history of legal and moral battles. It had effectively shed its old negative image. It had transformed into a clean, well-organized, and widely respected sport and recreational activity. Modern bowling centers became bright, family-friendly places where people of all ages could gather. They were places for birthday parties, corporate events, competitive league play, and casual fun. The bans and severe restrictions that once plagued the sport for so long mostly faded away into history, becoming historical footnotes. They became interesting relics of a very different time in American social and legal history when public morality was enforced through very different means. The story of bowling's bans and its subsequent triumph is a powerful reminder. It shows us how deeply society's values can change over time. It illustrates how new or evolving forms of entertainment can face intense resistance from established norms and moral guardians. It demonstrates how moral panics and societal anxieties can profoundly shape laws and public perception, often leading to restrictive policies. But perhaps, most importantly, it also shows how a sport or any cultural activity can adapt, reform, and fight for its place. It can evolve to meet new expectations and overcome entrenched biases through organization, innovation, and persistent public relations. And it can eventually become a beloved and enduring part of a nation's culture, just as bowling did in America. It's a true testament to its inherent appeal and the resilience of the people who believed in it. Bowling started its American journey in the shadows of taverns and faced constant legal challenges. But through adaptation and perseverance, it ended up shining brightly across the entire nation, becoming a symbol of accessible fun for millions.